Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to be taking a deep dive and tackling a longly debated topic that is still very popular, and that is what barrel length AR is ideal for you. Which one should you get? That is a question we still get, and usually when we get that question, we have to ask a few follow-up questions to our customers. One of those being, what do you need the gun to actually do? And the most common response we get is, I want it for a self-defense gun, something to keep in the house, to keep in the car, something along those lines. So for the context of this video, that's going to be the purpose that we are kind of speccing out a gun for. That's what we're looking for, the ideal personal defense barrel length for a civilian. Now, there are several other factors that we're also going to be discussing in this video that go into that. Things like the gas system on the gun, or perhaps legal considerations. You know, maybe you don't want an SBR, an AR pistol. So those kind of things are at play as well, and we're going to bring those up in the video. We have geared this video towards those of you who are less familiar with ballistics. So if that's you, you're in the right place. But if you do know a thing or two about ballistics, stick around, because we actually have compiled data from several other places online as well and brought that into our information that we're going to try to digest in this video. So we've got kind of one spot where you can get a lot of information. We've also taken that data and compiled it into several charts, and we're going to interpret it several different ways that I think are going to be more useful to you guys. But at the very least, it's going to give you a better, more well-rounded perspective on what all this information even means. So with all that being said, guys, grab a drink, sit back, relax. It's about to get retarded.
So essentially how we're going to conduct a test is we're using a chronograph to measure the velocity of the bullet as it leaves the muzzle. We're going to shoot a 5-shot string, take the average of the velocities. Once we have all that done, we're going to graph the results and actually compare them from one barrel length to the other, one projectile to the other. Now, it's important to note, while we are focused on barrel length and velocities for this video, there are several factors that come into play with the performance of a barrel, such as the material, the gas system, the profile, twist rate. Are you suppressed? Are you unsuppressed? If you are suppressed, you have to remember the overall length, the increased heat, the increased wear. All of these things need to be considered. Additionally, there are legal considerations. The National Firearms Act requires that any rifle that's under 16 inches be registered and a $200 tax stamp be paid. Some states, that's not even enough, and you're not able to do that. There are steps you can take, such as 14.5, 13.7-inch barrel, where you can pin the muzzle device to create an overall length of 16. There's also the option of an AR pistol, but again, you're going to run into legal issues with that in certain states and in general, even federally. It's a little bit muddy right now. So really, it's important that you consider all of these factors when you're trying to decide what barrel length is good for you.
Another huge factor when looking for a certain level of performance out of your gun is going to be ammunition selection. I think in this video today, you're going to see how drastically ammunition can actually affect how a particular barrel length will perform. Certain ammunition, like 55 grain 223, may have a higher velocity than something like a 77 grain 556, but it has less weight, less mass, and a lower ballistic coefficient. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, ballistic coefficient is essentially a measurement that tells us how efficient that projectile is at flying through the air. So something with a higher ballistic coefficient is going to be much more efficient flying through the air and maintain its velocity for a longer range, versus something with a lower ballistic coefficient that is going to slow down much faster or at a greater rate once it leaves the muzzle. Additionally, certain ammunition may be designed to do certain things. Let's say fragment, tumble, or expand. The manufacturer may require a certain minimum level of velocity in order for that round to perform reliably. If we incorporate that in what we consider effective for a particular barrel length, it will also drastically change the results. Here's an example. If you're a law enforcement agency and you're shooting soft point 62 grain 223 ammunition out of 11.5-inch barrels, and you need it to achieve a minimum velocity that's only present out to 100 yards, well, you'll be able to walk away from that test and say the 11.5-inch barrel is only effective out to 100 yards. But that's with a caveat, and that's a big caveat, that it's only with that ammunition in order to get it to perform reliably as intended. It doesn't necessarily mean that an 11.5-inch gun isn't still lethal past 100 yards. All right, guys, so we got finished at the range. We did all of our shooting, and I went ahead and I put a bunch of data into several different charts. Like I mentioned earlier, we're using data not only from us, but from some other channels. So I'm gonna go over that with you guys. Let's go ahead and I'm just gonna dive into it, and I'll kind of explain some of the stuff along the way. If you guys have any questions, the first chart I'm gonna pull up here, which these charts will be on the screen for you guys to see as well. This one is from Jimmy Rodriguez, Jim's Goon Life, at least that's what the channel was called before. And this chart's a little bit weird. This is just how it populated when I pulled it up the first time, and for some reason the higher velocity is on the lower end of the chart for some reason. I don't know why that is, and it's not at the farther end, but the differences are there. You can see the differences based on the color of the gaps between the different velocities. Now, as you can see, he's got the 10.5, the 12.5, the 14.5, and the 16, and the different types of ammunition. Obviously, the 77 grain is going to be traveling the slowest. It's the heaviest cartridge that's out there, and the 55 grain is the fastest, and you can see those different velocities on there. Now, I'm looking right now at the 10.5, 55 grain, 2600 FPS. 2600 for some reason seems to be kind of a minimum velocity for some people, and that is for a number of reasons. But when we're looking at this and we're talking about ammunition and its effectiveness downrange, which we're going to get more into that here, it's not just about velocity. Velocity is really only half of the equation. It's really about energy. So it's velocity and the mass. So we're going to see that too and look in some other charts here. I think you guys will be able to tell that the different ways of interpreting the data kind of gives us a different impression of, what we're going to see as far as capability for the different barrel lengths here. Now I'm going to go over to Classic Firearms. I'm going to look at their total velocity here. So this is another sheet, and they only tested one type of ammunition, it's PMC 55 grain, and they tested through all these different barrels. And what I think is kind of interesting here is they tested a 16-inch MCX and a 16-inch AR. I don't remember the barrel that was in this, but we'll be sure to link some of these videos that I'm getting this data from below. So if you guys want to look at more, you can check out some of those videos too. And there is a slight difference of, let's say, roughly 7 FPS on average between the two. It's not much, but there is a slight difference there, which kind of brings us back to the point of barrel materials, or the twist rate. The different factors in the barrel can actually affect the total velocity that you're getting out of that cartridge on average, at least to some degree, even though it's slight in this case. What's very interesting here, I think, is that generally speaking, we understand an increase in barrel length to mean an increase in velocity. That's not always the case. Right here, we actually see a decrease in velocity on average going from the 12.5 to the 14.5 with these particular barrels that he was using and that particular ammunition on that day. Very interesting that they were able to get that result, but you can see it doesn't always make sense. There's sort of this X factor involved here, and we don't really know, at least I don't really know what that is. Perhaps you guys can kind of inform us, where occasionally we see this in the data where actually there's a decrease in velocity when you add some length to it. So again, this is only with particular types of ammunition, particular barrels. So now I'm going to go to another sheet from Classic Firearms that I made, and this is the spread. So this is the spread between the barrel lengths, what you're getting by going up in barrel length. This is just showing you the increase or decrease in velocity here. So 10.3 to their 11.8, you add 132 FPS. The next bump is 145 FPS when you go up to 12.5. The 12.5 to 14.5, again, you drop about 26 FPS. And then the 14.5 to 16, you're getting about 102. So the biggest increase we saw with this ammunition on this data was going from 11.5 to 12.5. So next, I'm going to go into some data. This is from the 110 SAS channel. And this is a crazy chart here. I'm gonna have to make this bigger on my screen so that I can see everything. He's got several different types of ammunitions here in several barrel lengths, and the video is linked below. I couldn't include all the barrel lengths for this portion of it because there's a lot more than this, but I included the ones where we're kind of testing 10.3 to 16. That's what I want to stick with in this, because remember the context. It's a defensive gun for a civilian. So we're looking here at this data, and what I think this shows you here is the importance of ammunition. So we have a couple different 77 grain rounds here. We have Federal Gold Medal Match 77 grain, we have Black Hills 77 grain, we have the Badlands 77, and we have the Shell Shock 77. So we have 4 different cartridges that are 77 grain. We also have 2 55 grain. We have PMC and we have the Shell Shock. Now, Shell Shock, it isn't as widely available as some of the other types of ammunition. It, from what I understand, is a revisiting of some of the 5.56 cartridges out there, looking at kind of the case design in order to increase the pressures in it so the ammunition can still be reliable but hold higher pressures so you can get more performance out of some of these rounds. But you can see the 10.3, we go from 2,700 FPS to over 3,000 FPS just by changing the cartridge, or the way the cartridge is loaded in the casing, not necessarily the grain weight or anything like that. So that's a pretty significant increase in velocity by adding some powder to this. So that's what I'm talking about different ammunition. And then you can look at all these 77 grain rounds here, and they all perform differently. On the 10.3, 2291 out of the Black Hills, but then 2483 out of the Shell Shock. That's a pretty big increase. That's 200 FPS, just about 200 FPS, and I'm kind of rounding off my numbers here a little bit. So you can see some of these. What's even more interesting is with the 55 grain ammo, we actually see a decrease in performance going from 10.3 to 11.5, but then we see an increase in performance with the 77 grain ammo. That's very interesting with those shorter barrel lengths there. There's no 12.5 in this chart, but there is a 14.5, and you guys can see the rest of the data and kind of observe there. So feel free to screenshot this and keep this data if you want. I kind of simplified it. We can look at some of the 77 grain data here on this chart, and we're looking at Black Hills and Shell Shock, and we're looking at the spreads again, so the increase in FPS. And really, there's not much increase going from the 10.3 to 11.5 or the 14.5 to 16. The biggest increase by far here, and it's drastic, is going from 11.5 to 14.5. So for whatever reason, that barrel length seems to be a sweet spot based on this data. And we can also look at the 55 grain data here, again from 110 SAS's channel, and we kind of get the same thing. There is a little bit more of an increase going from the 14.5 to the 16, but still the greatest increase is the 11.5 to the 14.5. And remember, we don't have a 12.5 in this, so we are adding 2 inches to the barrel, whereas the 14 to 16 is 1.5 inches, so you're not adding quite as much. And then the 10.3 to 11.5, it's only 1 inch difference. But for the next one, I want to look at some of the Garand thumb data here, and I've got the first chart, which is what I'm calling the stacked chart, and what that means is it's starting from 0, and we're looking at all the velocities he got from his testing, 10.3 all the way to 16. He's using AAC 55 grain ammo out of Noveske barrels, so he kept the barrels consistent, kept the ammo consistent, and we can see all the differences here. There's a slight increase as you go up in barrel length. Now I am going to go into some other data on this chart here too. Here is the spread chart from it, showing the biggest differences in barrel length. So the jump from 10.3 to 11.5 is the biggest jump, and then from there are smaller jumps incrementally as you go up. He also included a 13.7 in here, so kind of take note of that. And I apologize for the inconsistency there in some of this data, that we don't have exactly the same barrel lengths between different channels and things like that. But very interesting here. It seems like the 11.5 to me seems like a good choice, but what we can look at here is what I'm calling an energy chart. So I'm going to pull up the Garand Thumb energy chart here. Now I want to explain this real quick. I do have this for our data that we took as well. I don't have this chart for some of the other data that I just went over, but you could plug this into a ballistic calculator, which is what I did. I used Kestrel, an online calculator through Kestrel, in order to get this data here. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking the velocity, I'm taking kind of the standard atmospherics that are default, and I'm just keeping that the same across the board. And then I am taking the ballistic coefficient and the weight of that cartridge, plugging that in, and it's going to tell me in, you know, an accurate, or let's say a somewhat accurate idea of what this round is going to perform like downrange. Why does that matter? Well, again, energy is what matters here. Energy is kind of like how this round is going to be effective. You know, whether that's you need this hollow point to expand, or you need the round to tumble or fragment. You want enough energy for it to be able to do that. So I don't know what your standard is going to be. So what I did is I put a couple of marks on here. Basically, when the round goes transonic, that is when it goes from supersonic to subsonic, and it goes through that transition period, it destabilizes and it's really difficult to hit anything. So I consider that max effective range. You may consider that, you know, not consider that max effective range, but I consider that max effective range because it's really difficult to hit anything past that. And then we put 2 energy equivalents in here. And basically what that means is, when does this cartridge fall below the energy and velocity equivalent of a Glock 19 shooting 124 grain at point blank? And when does it go below the energy of a 22 LR out of something like a Ruger Mark IV at point blank? Those are what you're seeing here, and these are yardages. And to explain the yardages, basically, when I looked at this calculator, is it in 50-yard increments? And then when it drops below that threshold, that is what I consider the cutoff for that range. So let's say it was 250 foot-pounds of energy, and at 250 yards, it's 251 foot-pounds of energy. Then at 300 yards, it's now below 250. That's what I would cut it off as 300 yards. So that's how I'm putting this data on here, just so you guys know. But what's interesting is, even though you have increases in velocity in some of these barrel lengths, based on the ballistic coefficient of these rounds and those atmospherics and the weight of the round, this is what you're getting. And some of these, it doesn't really make a difference. Even though you have a jump in velocity, it doesn't make a difference. So what we're seeing here is, let's go over the transonic real quick. From the 10.3, it's 450 yards before it goes transonic and the bullet destabilizes. If you go all the way to the 16-inch barrel, it's only a 100-yard difference. Even though there's a pretty big velocity difference there, you're gaining 100 yards. At the 14.5, it's still 550 yards. It's the same as the 16. In fact, the 13.7 to 11.5 are all identical yardages. So that's pretty interesting here. Now, when you look at the 9mm energy, the 13.7 all the way to the 16, it's 400 yards of energy that's equivalent to a 9mm out of a Glock 19 point blank. Just something very interesting there. And then a buddy of mine, he used to consider 22 at point blank pretty lethal, and that was his cutoff. So I included that in here too, and you can see that those extend well beyond the transonic ranges. So you're still hitting much harder and faster than a 22 LR at point blank, even at the transonic ranges. So just take that for what it's worth. This is just information we tried to compile here. You guys can kind of interpret this how you want, but that is the Garand Thumb data there. So now I am going to go into the Big Tex Ordnance data, and this is our first chart. This is the total velocities we're getting. Now we tested 3 different rounds out of each barrel length, 11.5, 12.5, 14.5, and then 2 16-inch barrels. The 16-inch, all of these barrels are Hodge except for the last one that says PR, that's for proof research. We wanted to see if there is a significant difference, just like in the classic firearms testing. They did the MCX, so we want to see if there's a difference there. But we tested 55 grain 5.56 MagTech. We tested 62 grain Spear Gold Dot 223, not 5.56, so it's typically not loaded to the same pressures. And then we tested 77 grain MagTech, which 77 grain MagTech's usually loaded pretty hot. And you can look at the data here, and what is pretty interesting is the difference in the barrel makeup from the Hodge to the Proof Research. You can see there is a slight difference in some of those. We actually get a little bit slower velocity out of the 55 grain, but we don't see as much of a difference with the 77 grain. It's very close, like within 5 FPS. And then there is a little bit of a difference with the 62 grain. But the Hodge is typically a little bit faster out of the barrel than these. So Hodge has got something going on where you're getting a little bit more velocity out of their barrel. And then again, you can look at some of the differences here, and it seems to me like we have a big jump between the 12.5 and the 14.5, but I'm going to look at our spread chart now. And this again is the differences that you're getting between barrel lengths. I'm not including the Proof Research in this one, but these are the jumps that you're seeing. And it looks like with the 77 grain, sweet spot seems to be 14.5 because there's not much of a jump going from 14 to 16. But you do get a little bit of a jump going from the 11.5 to the 12.5. 74 FPS with the 77s, and 120 FPS with the 77s from 12.5 to 14.5. So a lot of information here. I know you guys, we just want to be as well-rounded and give you guys as much of a picture as possible on this. Now, I'm going to show you some data from the 55 grain first. This is the energy with each round. Again, we've got kind of a similar thing between the 12.5 and the 14.5 where you're not adding much. You're about 50 yards for transonic, and it's exactly the same for the 9mm energy. The difference from the 11.5 to the 16 is about 100 yards when it comes to the 9mm energy. Pretty interesting there. So when I look at these energy charts, it doesn't seem like there's as drastic of a difference because you really need like a lot more velocity, it seems, in order to like bump up another 50 yards in, downrange performance. Now let's look at the 77s. If you compare this, especially to the last chart we look at, you'll notice, and I'm going to go to the last chart again. You'll notice you get a pretty decent increase in energy at these distances, even though the round is slower. So again, this goes back to the idea of we need energy. We don't necessarily need just pure velocity. We need energy, and the weight of the round helps in that. So you can see 550 yards now for 11.5 as far as, the 9mm energy, equivalent energy we're getting out of it, and 600 yards before it goes transonic. I mean, that's crazy with the increase there that you're getting. And then 14.5 and 16 are both identical. All of them have more energy than a 22 up point blank past 1,000 yards. And this last chart I want to show you, I'm going to include all of our charts that we've taken just so you can kind of do with it what you will, but I'm not going over every single one in this video because I put together a lot of data, and this is already quite a bit for this portion of the video. We're looking here at an 11.5 using the different ammos, 55 grain, 62 grain, and the 77 grain. What are our increases in performance we're getting in energy, just so you can kind of get an idea of how the ammunition is affecting this, and that the slower ammunition is actually doing the best here because it is the heaviest, and that's the 77 grain, has the best ballistic coefficient, which means it flies through the air more efficiently, so it's not slowing down as quickly. Whereas the 55 grain, it may come out a lot faster, but then it's slowing down a lot faster after it gets into the atmosphere and begins that process. So the 9mm energy for me is what I consider adequately lethal and sort of the effective range. And then again, the transonic is the max effective for me. 77 grains, and this is out of the 11.5, 550 yards. I mean, that's, for the context of our video, personal defensive gun for a civilian, 550 yards, that's a long way off. So let's go ahead and wrap this video up with some of our final thoughts. I think it's important to go back to the mission that we set out and defined at the beginning of this video. We asked the question, what barrel length would be best, specifically in the context of a civilian for personal defense use? Now, I actually put out another video recently going over one of my rifle builds where I get into the weeds on some of the information that's out there on civilian shootings and personal defense situations, and what kind of distances we're dealing with, what kind of situations we're dealing with. So if you want more information on that, go check out that video. But the short version is we're looking for something ideally that is effective within 50 yards. And if you want to stretch that out to say the most extreme situations, maybe out to 200 at the most. But that's really, I think, where the civilian personal defense context lives, because you're going to be dealing with in and around homes and vehicles. It's going to be a home defense gun, a truck gun, or something of that nature. So what does that mean for the barrel lengths and all the data we showed today? Well, depending on your definition of effective, my definition is the energy threshold that we put in those charts, which is a 9mm at point blank. All of these barrel lengths actually far exceed that capability. Even down to the 10.3, they almost double that effective range of the most that you could possibly need as a civilian. So then we get into some other questions on who's going to be using it, legal considerations, how are you going to be setting it up, and that sort of thing. With that said, getting into legal considerations, we did that section at the beginning of this video with Justin. And since then, there have been some changes that are worth noting in this video. So recently, the big, beautiful bill passed Congress and was signed by President Trump. And what that did was reduce the NFA tax stamp to $0. And effectively, the reason the NFA has been able to stick around so long is because the courts have ruled that Congress has the right to tax. We disagree with that here at Big Tex. We think that you can't tax a right and that the Second Amendment is an absolute right. We think that these things are protected, and Congress does not have a right to tax something that is a protected right, because essentially you are creating a second class of citizen. And it's only the wealthy that can afford to purchase the right to have their rights that would have those. So anyways, what the big beautiful bill potentially means is there could be a lawsuit against the NFA now that it is a $0 tax stamp, saying that it is not a tax because it doesn't generate revenue, therefore it is purely an infringement and there is no justification to have it. So we could potentially see the NFA go away soon. Additionally, we have seen 14.5 pin and weld guns come under attack, which I'm a little bit surprised with, being that how long those have been around and how long the legal precedent is around those. I don't think anything would happen with those, but you know, it's the government, and it doesn't matter if what they're doing is illegal, they're going to do it anyways, and they'll make your life miserable in the process. So that's another thing to consider, is they're even going after those now, which is a bit disappointing to see, but also, you know, I guess in the grand scheme of things, not all that surprising. So those are some considerations when we're, you know, a little bit of an update on our legal section there, considerations when you're looking at some of these different barrel lengths, because if we're talking about personal defense, you get in a shooting, your firearm is going to be scrutinized, and you just can't give them anything to work with that they could use against you. Not saying that that would create an unjust situation. It's not going to turn a lawful shooting into an unlawful shooting, but if they have an opportunity to go after you for something, they will. So I just wouldn't give them any ammo, no pun intended. So that said, what would my personal choice be? And I've talked to some of the guys, and I think most of us here are sort of in the same ballpark as far as our agreement, is that these shorter guns are more than adequate for sort of the situations that civilians are going to be coming across. I think the 11.5 is a really good platform because it's still really short, not quite as short as the 10.3, but it does offer a substantial performance increase depending on your ammunition. If you are going to be using 55 grain, you're really into you know, that really high velocity. Actually, there's some where the 10.3 exceeded the 11.5, believe it or not. And if you look at that data, you'll see which types of ammo we got that result with. So maybe a 10.3 would be ideal for you and even have better performance than an 11.5. But for me, for most situations, I'm going to choose the 11.5 and I'm going to shoot 77 grain ammunition. And that's because I like to run suppressed also. If I know that I am not running suppressed and I'm in one of those states where you just can't have one of those, or you know, you don't want to run into any type of scrutiny when it comes to an AR pistol or an SBR, then I would run something like a pin 14.5 or a pin 13.7, something like that. That's still really short, and really you're splitting hairs between those different barrel lengths. I think they're, you know, effectively, if you're running a can, they can effectively be the exact same length, just the 14.5 has slightly more performance, so I would choose the 14.5. That said, depending on muzzle device, a lot of times when they pin 14.5s, they can actually exceed the legal length by, you know, half an inch or whatever. So they actually sometimes are a little bit longer than the 13.7s, even though they're both pinned to that, you know, 16-inch overall length. And if you don't want to deal with the pin and weld, then you really don't have any choice. It would be like a 16-inch gun. And I really wouldn't go any longer than that, just because it's a little unwieldy when it comes to indoors, like if you have an 18 or something like that. So that's my personal opinion on it. And I think most people here are kind of in line with that. Some people really like the 12.5. That's a popular length here. And I think you can't go wrong with that either. So any one of these barrel lengths, honestly, after looking at all this data, I think what it tells us is it doesn't really matter. What matters is you have something and you're going to be training with it. You need to be competent in it, and not be a liability, and you need to have good decision making, because if there's one thing that we've seen when looking at a lot of this shooting data, we've seen good shoots and bad shoots, and none of us really cared what barrel length the person was using. We cared whether or not them pulling the trigger was the right decision. So that's really the important thing I think you should focus on, is pick a gun that's going to work for you, train with it, and make good decisions from there. So if you made it in the video this far, thank you so much. We're really grateful to have you, all your support and everything like that at this point. And please let us know your thoughts on this. Leave a comment. Any questions you have, leave them below, and we'll try to stay active in the comment section a little bit after this video goes up. Additionally, we are going to put out an article, so some of this information and some of the charts we use today are going to go into that article as well. I don't know if it's going to be before or after this video, but keep an eye out for that too if you want to kind of keep this information on hand as reference for something, or you just want to take a look at that later on. So thanks again, guys. Take care, and we'll see you next time.